Hi, welcome to F416 Lecture 8. Today we're going to talk about certification and accreditation. It's chapter 14 in the book. And I wanted to give you some more depth on certification and accreditation. The book kind of skips over a couple of things, and so it's important to know the history and what's going on. So the goal, of course, is to reduce risk. You remember the risk formula. So we're trying to always drive risk towards zero. Certification and accreditation is based on a DoD initiative to reduce the risk to classified data. So if you look at certification and accreditation, if you look in the history, it's all about the Department of Defense attempting to reduce risk. So it's now governed by what's called the Risk Management Framework, RMF, and it's written in law that all executive agencies have to follow the RMF process. So, and the idea was to harmonize agencies in the executive branch, so it doesn't cover Congress and it doesn't cover the Supreme Court. All had a different standard. And there was a lot of break-ins into government systems. So when the act was passed in 2002, giving NIST the responsibility of writing the standards, it also said that all the agencies will use RMF. Now, agencies can make stronger regulations. So you see, for example, in Department of Defense, you see the STIGs, the Security Technical Implementation Guidelines. So those have the configuration settings for various products in them. So DoD requires, as part of RMF, that you have applied the STIGs or you get a formal waiver for certain actions that are in the STIGs. We'll talk a little bit about controls on the slide that has the picture. And then certification says that you use approved products and methods, okay? If you don't, then you have to write some justification, and the authorizing official has to accept that documentation to essentially give you a waiver. You know, why are you not using a product that's listed on the approved products list, like Cisco routers, a certain version, okay? You're using in Industrial Control Systems, ICS, you're using a router made by the manufacturer of the, like Siemens, for example, makes their own routers. So you need a specific waiver in writing from the authorizing official that he's willing to accept that, that particular router. So otherwise, if you use approved products and methods, then normally the authorizing official will say, okay, that's fine, and you'll get a check mark for that. And then you go on to accreditation, and that's permission to process classified or sensitive data. It's now called authority to operate. So you have to have an authority to operate, and you go through this process, which you'll see in the next slide. And then we'll talk about a couple other processes. It's more or less adopted in all industries and other contexts, okay? So not-for-profits, government agencies that are not in the executive branch follow more or less that process. So I give a couple of examples and we'll talk about them. One is PCI DSS, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. So if you accept credit cards, you agree to use our process. And it's written in the contract. It's a contractual obligation as opposed to a legal obligation. If you're an executive agency of the law, you have to follow FISMA, the Federal Information and Security Management Act. If you accept credit cards, you sign a contract with your technology provider that says that you agree to their standards. So we'll talk about that a little bit. COBIT, control objectives for IT. So large organizations, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, many banks in the financial industry use COBIT. And COBIT is an example. We should back up a second. In the federal government, the RMF is what's known as a prescriptive standard. Okay, if you process sensitive data and you're a government agency, you have to follow these standards. It's prescriptive. COVID is an example of a descriptive standard. It says, well, you know, if you have IT, you ought to do these things. But it doesn't tell you how to do them. It just says you should do them. So when you do an audit, if it's written that they follow a certain standard, then you look to see, do they have the artifacts that say they follow standard. You interview people, do they seem to do that? Okay, but it doesn't have the force of law. It just has the force of those are the standards within that organization. And then ISO 27000 is another approach altogether, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. Okay, so here's the RMF process. At the top, the first thing you do, so you have a brand new system, you haven't done a certification or accreditation before, then you categorize. And you remember we talked about risk assessment, a qualitative, and you remember there was that chart with the colors, red, green, yellow sort of thing. So you categorize your system along confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And that determines what controls you. So next you select the controls out of the NIST standard. There's a manual, NIST 800-60, that says, here's all the controls. Oh, you have a high, medium, low, then you need the following controls. So that's what you select, the controls. That's what that means. Then you implement the controls. So you put them in place, you make the configurations, that sort of thing. And then you assess, you test to see, did implementing any of those controls break anything? This is important in running an application. So you've got a standard platform and it says you have to have your web server ABC, and then so you put those controls in, and then you go in and test it, and you discover, oh, the application doesn't work with ABC, it only works with AV and a slight modification to C. So you have to go back and write up what you had to do to the control. So that's what that assess phase is. And authorized to operate, right? So you're authorized to process classified data or sensitive data. In the case of PII, or HIPAA data, health data, it's not classified per se, but it's sensitive, right? Name, address, telephone number, your service record, stuff like that is private but not necessarily classified. And then finally you monitor, you test the effectiveness of your controls, right? We update our antivirus weekly. We monitor, did we catch any viruses during that period that we should have gotten, right? You run regular tests using the ICAR test virus, EICAR, for example. So you monitor, and then you at some point in the future you may have an event. So you go back and you may have to modify. We're going to select a different set of controls because we had an event that we didn't plan for, or you may have to modify the STIG and put it back in and change the application because you had an event that circumvented the fact that you didn't do a control. So that's RMF, Risk Management Framework. So all federal systems by law have to have that. So that's kind of interesting to see how formal that has become, and that is more like the commercial world. So it used to be that you would certify an accredited system and you might not even look at it for 3 years. Well, now you're required by law to monitor it on an ongoing basis. One of the documents, RMF process requires a lot of documentation. One of the documents is your security plan, and you have to indicate in there what I'm going to monitor for, and you have to have a continuous monitoring plan. So as part of your authority to operate, you need that document. So that's kind of how the RMF process has evolved. We're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about how a merchant or a service provider might, We're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about how a service provider or a merchant looks at credit card processing. So in this case, the certification and accreditation is based on what level, for example, of a merchant you are. So if you're a level 1, you process 6 million transactions a year, then once a year you have to have a report on compliance done by an independent third party. You can also do it by an internal auditor, but they recommend that internal auditor be trained, and then also an officer of the corporation has to sign. And then you have an attestation of compliance, so somebody has to sign by name that they agree that they're level 1 compliant or they're not. And then quarterly you have to be tested with a scan from the internet. Okay, so level 2, 1 to 6 million transactions. So the only difference from level 1 to level 2 is now you do a self-assessment questionnaire instead of having a third party. And then same thing with level 3. You do all that a level 1 does and a level 2, but you don't require a third party. And same thing with level 4. If you have a compromise, you're automatically a level 1. Regardless of what level you were when you had the compromise. So that's kind of how the payment card industry works. You agree contractually to follow their process for certification and accreditation, whether you build the application or buy the application, or who is your service provider, or who is your acquiring bank, that sort of thing. Everybody has the same set of requirements, but they're civil and they're based on contract as opposed to in law. Then you have the COVID approach. Remember, now this was a descriptive standard, so this says you ought to do certification and accreditation, and if you do certification and accreditation, this is how you should do it. Here's the objective of the control or set of controls for certification and accreditation. So you notice it's a little bit more descriptive. It's much less words compared to RMF. There's probably a couple thousand pages of things you have to do. This is reduced to 1 page. Now you as an organization may have more pages than this, but this is the minimum that an auditor looks for in terms of certification and accreditation. So that's a COVID approach, right? And finally, if you're an ISO 27000 organization, the approach is not so much on you as it is on the certifier and accreditor. So more time is spent on the organizations that do the audits as opposed to on the organization that they're auditing. Does that make sense? So they make sure that the experts, if you will, have gone through this process, so that when they come and look at an organization, and everyone is different, that's the idea, is each organization is going to have their own way of doing things. So we're going to spend more time making sure the certifier and accreditor have the right qualifications, so that then they're able to take the customer knowledge and apply it accordingly. Okay, thank you.